Welcome everyone to Stewards of the Beautiful Land. This is our webinar, Trees and Pollinators. We have a fantastic day presentation squared away for you with our very own Karen Zalkowski and Nick McGrath. We're not going to waste any time and we're going to get right into it because we have a very healthy agenda here for today. Welcome, everyone. These are our webinars for Stewards of the Beautiful Land. We have several more coming up in June on the 12th and the 26th, and then again in July on the 10th and the 24th. Mark those on your calendars, or better yet, go to the Trees Forever website and calendar, and go ahead and register for those. So that way you'll get a reminder email probably 3 days and a day before it actually starts. It's a wonderful way to stay informed, and then of course make it easy for you so you don't forget. These are the upcoming webinar topics. Our very own Karen is going to be talking about Forest Therapy 101, and then Bree is going to be talking about native seed cleaning. And so that's going to be a fun webinar on June 26th. We also have some field days that I wanted to point out for Stewards of the Beautiful Land. Our first one is actually kicking off this week on Thursday. This is going to be a plant sale and identification workshop at the Hartman Nature Preserve over in Black Hawk County. Then on June 5th, we have not one but two field days. The first one is going to be in Harrison County. The Traveling Prairie Display is going to be a great opportunity to take a prairie walk and learn about some of the species that are blooming right now. And then get your hands dirty, bring some gloves, because we're going to do an invasive species removal and native plant ID session in Des Moines County at Stars Cave Park. And then on June 6th, there's going to be a native plants and landscaping presentation at the Hartman Nature Preserve with Amy Davison. That's going to be another great one. And then June 18th, if you're over in the Ames area, Dr. Tom Rosberg at Doolittle Prairie. This is a prairie remnant. Oh, it's going to be a lot of fun taking a look at what's out there and blooming. And then as we get into July, over the 4th of July weekend, join Bree Hull for a prairie walk and history lesson, mind you, at the Darrell Smith Prairie on the campus of the University of Northern Iowa. All of these details can be found at our Stewards of the Beautiful Land landing page.
Okay, we are ready to go here. We have an absolutely fantastic presentation today revolving around trees and pollinators, and I'm going to get us started with a few words about Trees Forever, who we are, and then a refresher on what exactly is pollination and who are the pollinators we're talking about. We'll explore why pollinators are important, and then Nick McGrath is going to talk about trees and pollinators before we wrap up with Karen sharing with us all her trip to the mountains of Mexico to see the migrating monarchs up close and personal. Just a reminder, Trees Forever, and our mission to plant and care for trees and the environment by empowering people, building community, and promoting stewardship. We have over 30 years of award-winning programs. We have a staff of, I think we're up to almost 30 now when we figure in our AmeriCorps members and others and DNR. We have a staff of roughly 30 working in Iowa and Illinois. We are headquartered in Marion. We've planted over 3.5 million trees since our inception and since 1989. We've done national projects, and we are supported by individuals like you. So thank you very much. So what are pollinators? First, we need to set the stage for what we mean when we talk about pollinators. It's crucial to understand that while we talk about pollinators kind of in a general term, pollinators include many, many things. Most of us are familiar with bees and butterflies, but pollinators also include more mundane insects like flies and beetles and moths, and let's not forget about mammals like bats, bears, and yes, even humans. And even within insects, thousands of species comprise pollinators and have varying life cycles. So pollinators are not one thing, but many things that we collectively refer to as pollinators. I'm going to put my teacher's hat on for just a moment. And since we're talking about pollinators, I think it's worth remembering just what the act of pollination is all about. Pollinators transfer pollen from the male part of the plant, the anthers, to the female part of the plant, the stigma, resulting in the production of seeds and fruit. Why are pollinators important? Well, now that we know what pollination is, let's shift gears and talk about why pollinators are so important and why the concern over population declines the last decade or so. The short answer is that pollinators are crucial to a healthy ecosystem and food supply. Pollinators are sometimes thought of as the canary in the coal mine and are a key indicator of ecosystem health. Why? Well, the reason is because 90% of wild plants need cross pollination to survive and reproduce. When we put pollinators into the context of the overall food system, it's estimated that pollinators are responsible for roughly every third bite of food that we eat. A few facts and figures regarding pollinators and the food supply. 84% of commercially grown crops are insect pollinated. Pollinators affect roughly 35% of global ag lands. Native pollinators provide important pollination services for crops like alfalfa, melons, cranberries, blueberries, soybeans, sunflowers, and more. And the vast majority of pollinators are going to be our wild or native types of pollinators. A few facts and figures regarding pollinators and their value to society. Between 235 and 577 billion worth of annual global food production relies on the direct contribution of pollinators. In the United States, wild pollination is worth roughly 10 billion annually, and honeybee pollination, this is managed honeybee pollination, is worth roughly almost 20 billion annually. We know pollinators are important, but why? Why are pollinators in danger? Well, many factors contribute to declining numbers of pollinators in general, but we know that numbers are declining. So, among North American native bee species, again, that we have sufficient data to assess, more than half are in decline. And nearly 1 in 4 of our native bee species is imperiled and at increasing risk of extinction. Now, I absolutely love this photo because it shows very explicitly the importance of pollination. Insects and other pollinators do this work every single day for free as part of their daily routine of life. If they're not around to do this, someone else will need to. And a picture is worth 1,000 words. So why exactly are we seeing these declines in pollinator numbers? Well, many factors play into population declines of pollinators. Certainly, loss of habitat and seasonal forage, exposure to pesticides and other chemicals, invasive pests and disease are definitely a problem. And finally, a changing climate means changing landscapes. And some of these pollinators have very intimate relationships with specific plants. Well, sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, and pollinator habitat is much more than prairie. Perennials of all types can provide valuable habitat for forager nesting. Next up, Nick McGrath is going to highlight the role trees play in pollination and some key trees for our pollinator friends.
Awesome, thanks. Good to be here with you all. I'm here to take a few minutes of your time to talk about trees and pollinators. There is a tremendous amount of information that we could dive into, and I think just because of the scale of the topic of trees and pollinators, I'm going to touch on a couple of things. We have a collection of trees here, and I'm going to kind of go through them as a group, with singling out a couple of individuals as we go. But I really want to highlight the need for truly supporting our native pollinators and our migratory pollinators in a variety of ways. So we're going to start off here. A couple of things to consider when we think about pollinator support. When we often say the word windbreak, we think about agriculture. We think about rows of trees in between crops. But they're not just for that. They're not just for protecting your home from the snowdrift. A lot of pollinators will not go out and forage in winds that are over 20, 25, maybe even 30 miles an hour, depending on the species. And that really impacts pollinators at a very large scale. And so we need to create little buffers for them. When I think about that in practice, I think of hedgerows. Hedgerows are little alleys where pollinators can go safely from place to place. Those also provide some protection from potential predators. So I want you to establish large-scale windbreaks, medium, and I want to even think about small-scale windbreaks that you can use on your own properties. You know, do you have a garden and you really want some pollination activity to be happening there? You need to protect that garden from the wind in order to bring those pollinators into your space. And then certainly those windbreaks can help catch pesticide drift if you are adjacent or within the vicinity of places that apply those chemicals. That's very, very important. The next thing I want you to think about is diversity as it pertains to pollinators. So when we think trees, we want a diversity of species, sizes, shapes, and then for the flowers, we want a diversity of bloom times. If you're familiar with trying to grow apples in your home, you need apples that bloom at the same time in order for that cross-pollination to happen. If you get an apple that is an early bloomer and an apple that is a late bloomer, it's going to be difficult for you to get those two to cross. Now for pollinators, that's really helpful, right? We have a number of pollinators that come in to our area later in the season, and they need something to sustain them during that time. So we really need those summer blooming trees. And then the last bullet on the page is something that I really learned through my work at the garden center. The really cool thing is to have plants with double blooms. We have double blooming roses, double blooming peonies, but when you have all of those petals that we love, it really crowds that space that pollinators need in order to access the pollen and to complete the process. So if you can avoid those, and then I pulled different pictures of different pollinators and their mouth parts, because each is different in their own very unique way and requires a different kind of flower. So we need diversity of sizes, of shapes, and bloom times, but we also need a diversity in the shape of the flower itself so that different pollinators can come and enjoy all the benefits of that space. We don't want to single out or over promote one or over the other. So please do think about diversity in all of those different ways as you go about planning your space. I have a book here, The Nature of Oaks. If you're tuning into this webinar, you're probably familiar, at least in name, of Doug Tallamy. He has a tremendous amount of research out there about the oak tree and how beneficial it is for our pollinators. I'm just going to touch on them as a collected species because there is so much information there. It probably warrants its own entirely separate series to dive into the oak. But as a species, they support over 500 different types of moths and butterflies. As Jeff alluded to earlier, pollinators is a very broad category. And so when we think about that, the number that an oak supports is likely somewhere in the thousands. Because if you think of everything else that could be using it, the beetles, the flies, and as we add in the gall wasps that really utilize the oaks in a large and very obvious way sometimes to us, that number of species that it supports really starts to climb. Oaks are really important because they're an early nectar source for spring pollinators. I've got the oak flower there. They often fall. My daughter is 3 and she just thinks they're dirt patches on the ground. So we taught her that those are flowers. She thinks that's very cool. So it's a really, really vital nectar source, and it's a dependable habitat. Those oaks, because of their longevity, could support many, many, many generations of the same species on the same tree, because they are going to know that this oak tree is going to be here. It's going to be a reliable location for habitat and for food. I'm going to start to get into some trees that I think warrant more discussion. So the next one I have is the black cherry. I think it's a really great tree. It's hugely beneficial. It supports over 450 species, again, of just moths and butterflies. It flowers after the leaf emergence, so it's a little bit later food source for those pollinators. And the black cherry is interesting because it really requires insect pollination in order to regenerate. And there are some forests out near the East Coast where studies have shown it is entirely due to the miner bee that those black cherries were able to reestablish in the landscape. Without the miner bee, they would not have black cherry. It's a very interesting relationship. It was a neat rabbit hole to go down as I was putting this together. Lots of fun stuff to read. If you're interested, check out miner bees and cherry trees. It's very cool. It's also the host for the larva of the eastern tiger swallowtail. This is a really beautiful butterfly. I used to see a lot as a kid, and now I see less of. Again, we just need that support. And then the red spotted purple, again, I think is very pretty. The larva looks a little bit like bird poop, but it's a really good defense mechanism. So they need this black cherry. Please consider this in your landscape if you have some room. Our next overstory tree is a black willow. A lot of people don't think of willows as a top choice when it comes to pollinators, but they are hugely important because they do bloom so early in the year. Because of that, it supports over 400 species, again, of butterflies and moths, likely much more. And it's incredibly valuable, again, just because of the timing and because of how fast it grows. Kind of a live fast, give everything you have and die young kind of scenario for the black willow. It grows rapidly, it produces a ton of food, and it supports a lot of things in the process. Morning cloak is a particularly beautiful butterfly that relies on the black willow. I think this is our last overstory tree on the list, and it is the cottonwood. A lot of people shy away from this tree because of they're gonna say that it's messy. I would have to agree in the right setting, and certainly because of the cotton. But this is a hugely important tree. It's very, very important for foraging insects, especially the cottonwood dagger moth, specifically the cottonwood dagger moth. They're very useful in a windbreak, as long as it's away from structures due to its rapid growth. Again, because of that weak structure, they're seldom planted in town. Understandable, a lot of people have allergies. This is not a great tree for those people. But another really neat rabbit hole that I got to go down in making this presentation is the relationship between bees and the cottonwood tree. I did not know this prior to this presentation, but the bees use specifically the resin from the buds of the cottonwood to create a substance called propolis. And this is used to heal sick bees in the hive. It's used to repair holes in the hive. It's really, really cool. Fabulous substance. I did not know it came from a cottonwood. It was a really cool relationship, and just another example of why we need to support those pollinators in a variety of ways. They're using the tree not for food, but as a substance that they need in order to better their lives and continue the hive. Shrinking down just a little bit, we're going to talk mid and understory trees. I coined them small but mighty. We really need them. They provide tremendous pollinator support. There's a wide variety of things that could be lumped under mid and understory trees. They come in all sorts of bloom times, bloom shapes and sizes, colors. And one thing that I particularly like about mid and understory trees is that you can do some higher density plantings. I've given a couple of talks on this in the past, but if you go out into a residential area, you'll probably see a yard with a single tree. It's probably an overstory tree, and it's likely to have been pruned up to 20, 25 foot high if it's a mature tree. Well, why not underplant them with some smaller trees? This is, aside from the benefits that are going to come back to you as a homeowner with shade and cost savings there, it's going to create a really, really nice little space for your pollinators. right? They're going to be safe from predators. They're going to have a multitude of species to choose from to go about their work. Lots and lots of opportunities for some very dense, beautiful and supportive plantings when you utilize mid-story and understory trees. And the last one I want to highlight is particularly intriguing to me, and that's the pawpaw. The pawpaw is a tree that is tolerant of full shade and wet sites. So if you have a spot like that, say your drainage tiles all go down to the same place and it's shady, that would be a fabulous place for a pawpaw. It's an understory tree. It's not going to get very big. It's the leaves are unpalatable to deer and rabbits. And the pawpaw is interesting. Again, I'll go back to what Jeff started with pollinators being this big, large group. This supports the ones we don't think about, the carrion flies and the beetles. Again, we have a couple in our yard, and my daughter calls them the fly tree, because once they bloom, all the carrion flies come. They're not necessarily attracted to the pawpaw and the flower itself, but they thrive in that wet, dark habitat that the pawpaw lives. And this provides a really vital food source for those insects. And it's the only larval host of the zebra swallowtail. This, again, is a butterfly that I saw a lot as a kid, and I don't anymore. I would love to bring them back. The relationship between the zebra swallowtail and the pawpaw is very unique and species specific. There are a few others out there that are similar in nature as far as that relationship goes. But the zebra swallowtail chooses the pawpaw because it is so unpalatable to most other things. There's a pretty good chance that that larva is going to survive and grow up to be that beautiful butterfly that's there on the screen. And with that, I'll kind of segue into another species that relies heavily on a handful of things.
Well, thank you, Nick and Jeff, for an amazing start to our pollinator webinar. My coworkers have been talking about the importance of native trees, plants, and how beneficial they are for a variety of pollinators. Well, monarchs use those same plants and those same trees. So it's necessary for us to plant species that bloom throughout the entire season and throughout the entire monarch migration. So especially we need to plant milkweeds because this is the only plant that the caterpillar will feed on. And here in Iowa, we have 18 native milkweeds, and 5 of those are so rare that they're considered threatened or endangered. So it's pretty simple. If there's no milkweed, there's no monarchs. So along with milkweed, we also need to consider those plants that bloom a little bit later in the season, because the monarchs are going to feed from those plants and they're going to build up their fat reserves and store that in their abdomen to help them survive through the entire winter. So just a couple examples of some good prairie plants for those that late season would be the asters, your Joe Pye weed, blazing star, and bergamot, just to name a few. I know I have quite a bit of blazing star in my yard, and it is always filled with monarchs towards the fall time. They also need trees to roost and overnight. So those tree species here in the US includes large oaks and cottonwoods. And then they also need trees to overwinter in Mexico, which we'll talk about on another slide here. And of course, they need clean water sources. So why did I go to Mexico? Well, I spent about 22 years of my career as an environmental educator, and I was planting native species. I was teaching other people how to plant native species. And then I was doing a program about the biology and the life cycle of monarchs. I was also raising those monarchs. And then I've been known to run around the prairie to catch monarchs in order to tag them for their migration. So super excited about monarchs and spreading that word with everybody else. And I kind of learned things as I went. But for me, this needed something more. It needed a little bit more of a connection. So my connection became full circle when I actually traveled down to Mexico to see those overwintering sites. So before I share more details about my travels, it's important to understand the life cycle and the migration of the monarchs. So they go through what we call a complete metamorphosis, and this takes them about 30 days. So they'll go from that egg to caterpillar to chrysalis to butterfly. And it's a complete metamorphosis because each stage looks very different than the adult, unlike a grasshopper who goes through an incomplete metamorphosis. So like this, the young grasshopper looks like just a smaller version of the adult grasshopper. So the female will lay eggs over a 2 to 5 week season. And a little question for the audience out there. How many eggs does a female lay over the egg laying season? And again, that's 2 to 5 weeks. Go ahead and answer in the comment section there. And I'll go ahead and give you the answer. So they lay between 300 to 500 eggs over that 2 to 5 week span. And they're going to lay these eggs only on milkweed plants. So when you're out looking for eggs, you're usually going to find them on that bottom side of the leaf, occasionally on the top. And then you also need to check on those teeny tiny leaves right in the center that are just coming up, because sometimes she will lay them right on those little leaves that are very small, and it's easy to miss those eggs, because keep in mind, this egg is very tiny and it's hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. But once you find a few, it gets a little bit easier to find them. And they'll be in this egg stage for about 3 to 5 days. And then they turn into that yellow, black, and white caterpillar that looks very familiar to many of you. And they will be 11 to 18 days in this stage, and they go through 5 instars. So that means the really teeny tiny caterpillar that you first find is in its first instar, and it will eat and eat and eat, and then it will shed its exoskeleton, and then it will eat some more, shed its exoskeleton again, and it'll go through that 5 times. And on that last time is when it starts to form that chrysalis. So monarch butterflies have this really, really beautiful chrysalis in my mind, because it's this bright sort of emerald green color with little dashes or little dots, a little line of gold around the top there. So when they're in their chrysalis, this is when they go through a huge transformation. So they develop their wings, they get their 6 legs, and they get their compound eyes. And then once this chrysalis starts to turn black, you're going to be able to see the butterfly inside, and then it will slowly emerge out, and it'll be all wrinkled up. And then you'll need to let it, you'll notice that it'll flap its wings to kind of dry. And then once it gets completely dry, that butterfly that you see in the last picture there will fly away and go to feed. So adults live for about 2 to 6 weeks. And the last generation lives about 8 to 9 months. So we'll kind of talk about those generations on one of our next slides. So this is why it's so important to have those native plants and milkweeds and flowers throughout each stage and along that migration route for these butterflies, because without those food sources, they wouldn't survive. So this map does a great job of showing the migration routes. So there is more than one migration route. If you go over to California, you can see that they kind of they go to California, they go north, they come back. Very simple migration. And then over on the east part of the state, they will go to Florida, fly up a little ways, fly back down to Florida, not nearly as far as the butterflies that are here in the Midwest. So a butterfly can travel or fly as far as 3,000 miles to reach Mexico, and that's roughly 1,200 to 2,800 miles. And they will often fly 50 to 100 miles per day, and that's depending on the wind current. So if you have a really windy day, they're going to get picked up by that current, and they're going to fly a little bit further than maybe they would when they're just flapping their wings. And they fly for a while during the day. So this is your next question here. So how many hours do you think the monarch flies during its migration season? Go ahead and pop your answers in the questions there. How many hours do they fly per day? So they fly 3 to 4 hours per day, and this entire journey takes them about 2 months to go from the northern part all the way down to Mexico. And people always ask me, well, how high do they fly? So they've been shown to fly at 800 to 1,200 feet, with the record being 11,000 feet. And they've also been seen from airplanes. So this is absolutely amazing to me when you think about this tiny little butterfly, and it can fly that high and still somehow make it all the way down to Mexico. So I'm going to tie in citizen science here for a second, because a lot of what we know about monarchs is because of volunteers and because of public observations. So one simple thing that you can do is offer food sources by planting those native species that benefit monarchs and their other pollinators. And each plant that you plant actually does make a difference. So if you can see this large, bold red line here, that's basically the route of I-35. And there's been the Iowa DOT, along with other state DOTs and conservation groups and just private landowners, that have focused a lot on planting different plants that are beneficial to the monarch butterfly. So where the dashed line is where there's a high monarch production. So you can see Iowa falls in that, along with Minnesota. And then as you go all the way down to Mexico, that's that kind of I-35 route. And if you're interested in learning more about some citizen science that you can do that relate to monarchs, we are going to have Nathan Brockman with Ryman Gardens is going to be presenting a webinar on August 7th. So you can learn more about pollinators, citizen science, and the importance of those natives. And that will be listed on our treesforever.org website, so you can find out more information about that event. So this might seem surprising, but not all monarchs migrate. Not every monarch goes to Mexico. It's the fourth generation, are the great-great-grandchildren that are born in the north that go to Mexico. So here in Iowa, some of those monarchs will breed at the beginning of August. And that, if you assume that that is the fourth generation from the north, their offspring is the fifth generation, and those are the ones that are going to travel all the way down to Mexico. So right now, we're starting to see monarchs that are coming back up from Texas, returning from that southern area. And if you go outside and look on the milkweeds, you might be finding eggs. And you might also be finding those first and second instars of caterpillars. And then in the fall season, which begins late August to mid-September here in the Midwest, is the time for when they're going to start traveling back down to Mexico, and when we typically tag those monarchs. So if you want to know more about tagging and why we tag, you can join us on September 6th at Big Hollow Recreation Area, which is located in Des Moines County. So we're going to partner up with their conservation board, and we're going to teach you how to tag monarchs and why we're tagging them. This event is part of the Stewards of the Beautiful Land Field Days. So where did I go and when did I go? So I stayed in a small town of Macheros, which their population is about 400. According to the locals, they will tell you a little bit less than that. And it's approximately 2.5 hours from Mexico City to the Sierra Pelone B&B, which is where I stayed, located in that town of Macheros. So I traveled in March of 2020 and in March of 2024. So I have great plans to go back in the off season just to do some hiking and horseback riding. And my goal is now to go visit the monarchs in each month over the next few years. Also, some people stay in Zitácuaro, which is also 2.5 miles from Mexico City. And then if you want to travel from there to Macheros to go to the Sierra Pelone Sanctuary, that's about 15 to 20 minutes. So the monarch season in Mexico is November 20th to March 15th. So that's kind of when they arrive to when they leave. But January and February is the prime time to visit, or when most people visit. This is where you're going to see large amounts of clusters of these butterflies, and they're going to be just hanging out in the trees there. You're going to experience something different any date that you go, or any day that you go in Mexico, because with weather changes and just temperature changes, you're going to experience something different each time. So just a heads up for you out there, if you get car sick, please keep in mind this is a rough car ride from Mexico City to the mountainous area. It's also very windy hills, and there's also that factor of the elevation change there. So if I had to say, out of the sanctuaries that I visited, if you can only go to one location, I would go to Sierra Pelone. This is the least touristy. There are no shops. There's no restrooms. It is a 2-minute walk or less from the B&B. Their guides speak English. They're locos to Mancheros, and they have been watching these butterflies for their entire life, and they truly care about the forest and the monarchs, and they have become part of their culture. And the second one I would say would be Sierra Chinqua, which is 2 hours from Sierra Pelone. This sanctuary has restrooms, shops, places to eat. You'll typically, at any sanctuary you go to, you will ride the horses up the mountain, and then you'll hike your way down. Third one is El Rosario, and this is probably the most touristy one that I visited. Just a lot more shops, and once you get up to the top, kind of, so to speak, where the butterflies are, you'll walk back down, and then they have a lot of stairs that take you back down to the parking lot area there. So this map does a great job of showing us where the traditional monarch butterflies are overwintering. So there are about 12 sites or sanctuaries, and at least 70% of these monarchs are typically found concentrated in only 3 sites there. So these 3 sites where they're typically found are in the region of central Mexico, and it's in the states of Michoacan and Mexico. And these areas are like 5-star hotels for these monarchs. So this is a great graph of showing our overwintering sites each year. So this year, the monarch numbers were really low. So they occupied about 0.9 hectares. And each hectare, just to put it into perspective for you, is about 2.5 acres. And so each year you'll see that they kind of vary on how much space that they take up, but it's estimated between 20 to 30 million monarchs per hectare. And the presence of these butterflies is typically in the Oyamel fir forests. And this population this last season was 59.3% less than the previous year. And it's 1.3 less than the 2.21 acres in the 2022-2023 overwintering season. So this is huge for monarch populations. It's the first time since 2013 and 2014 that their overwintering season has been less than 1 hectare for them. So in order to maintain the population numbers, scientists say about 6 hectares and about 14.8 acres. So people are like, okay, why this decrease in monarchs? Well, there's lots of reasons why there's a decrease. So there's climatic changes in Canada and the US. We're seeing higher temperatures. We're seeing droughts. There's a reduced amount of milkweed for them to feed on. We also are seeing land use changes in the US, and the widespread use of herbicides has contributed to the loss of milkweed and other nectar plants that the adults need to feed on. So if you take a look like towards the southern part here, and you find that area where there's sort of where it's black in color, these are the areas where they typically go from October to late March. And so if you are going to these areas and you are a monarch butterfly, this is absolutely the best travel spot in the world. So they are going to roost in the Oyamel fir, pine, and cedar forests. And so these trees are at about 2,400 to 3,600 meters high. So that's roughly 1.5 to 2 miles above sea level. The forested mountainsides there provide the ideal microclimate for butterflies. The temperatures are going to range from 0 to 15 degrees Celsius and 32 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So if the temperature is lower than that, the monarchs are forced to use their fat reserves that they had built up before migrating. And the humidity in the Oyamel forest also assures that the monarchs won't dry out, which allows them to conserve their energy over the winter. So just to take a look here, these are the Oyamel firs. To me, they look a lot like the firs that we see here in Iowa. So the typically sort of flat needles. These are very straight when they grow, and they are super tall when you're up there hiking through them. And then the monarchs also like to roost in smooth bark Mexican pine, or it's also called Mexican cedar or the cypress trees. So you can just see here on the left is the pine trees. I think they look a lot like our white pine trees here in Iowa with the softer needles, except for these needles are extremely long. And then on the right side there, you're going to see those berries from our cedar trees. So what did I see when I hiked up the mountain? Well, I saw lots of clustering of butterflies. So in this picture, you can see from the top of that tree all the way down, that's all monarch butterflies. And then kind of towards the back of the photo there, you can see what looks like something hanging from the trees. Those are also clusters of monarchs. So they estimate around 15,000 monarchs on a single branch. So my question for you is, how much do you think a monarch butterfly weighs? So each monarch weighs less than a gram, and that's equivalent to about one small paperclip. And so this is what clustering looks like up close. So you'll see it's just butterfly after butterfly. You're seeing very little of the branches and very little of those needles from the trees there. And it makes sense for these monarch butterflies to cluster together like this. Monarchs, like other insects, are cold-blooded, so they are warmer when they're stuck together. And if you are in the forest and you have the chance to see one of these large clusters just fly up all at once, they call this an explosion or a kaleidoscope of butterflies. And I watched this a few times, and it's absolutely amazing because when you're standing there in the forest and it's super quiet, when they explode like that, you just hear all the flapping of all the wings from the butterflies. It's pretty impressive. You will also see butterflies that are basking in the sun. So the photo on the right here, they're just hanging out on the trees. They'll flap their wings a few times and just rest there. And they're basically just sitting there waiting for that sun to warm up their body temperature. They will also do something that's called shivering, which is a way for them to warm up their muscles. And basically they will move their wings so fast that it actually warms up their bodies. So in order for a monarch to be able to fly, it has to be 55 degrees, at least 50 on a sunny day, and then 60 on a cloudy day. And they can't crawl if it's not 41 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the photo on the left, this is Joel. He's the owner of Sierra Palone B&B. He's also a guide. He's a local, so he's lived there most of his life. And you can see there's monarchs there on the ground. He's picked one of those monarchs up, and what he's doing is he's going to cup his hands, and then he'll gently blow air into his hands that will help warm the butterfly. And then seconds after this photo happened, that butterfly just flew off, so it was warm enough. And you will also see a lot of huddling and feeding in Mexico. So you typically see a lot of feeding going on here in the Midwest as they're, getting ready to lay eggs or as they're going back down to Mexico. So the photo on the right just shows a bunch of butterflies, hanging out there in those flowers, soaking up some of that nectar. They'll typically cover that flower because in the mountains, there's not a lot of flowering plants up there. It's mainly just trees. And so the butterflies need to drink just like we do, but they obviously can't land on that water. So instead, they're going to sip up the liquid from the muddy soil. And that not only provides the moisture, but also salts and dissolved minerals that the butterfly needs. So the male uses those minerals to produce pheromones that they use to attract their mate. And these minerals are passed on to the female during reproduction. And these are just to help support her egg laying. So I'm going to play a video here where you can see them puddling. And if you're not along like a creek side, you can just take your water bottle and pour out a little bit of water onto the ground, and the monarchs will just like swarm to that space because they're looking for that water. You're also going to see a lot of mating. So mating can occur either sitting in the tree at the top photo there, or it can occur on the ground above the creek bed. It also can occur like in the air. So you'll often see these two butterflies clinging together, and then they'll land during that final moment on the ground. And once the male is attached to that female, the process takes up to 16 hours. And in monarchs, the breeding season for individuals, they are sexually mature at 4 to 5 days after they emerge as adults. And that generation that migrates is not sexually mature until after the overwintering period. So this is a video coming up here in 2020 that I took in Sierra Palone. And basically we had rode the horses up, we got off, we hiked a little ways, we started to see more and more butterflies. And then we got to this Old Creek Valley and we started to walk down that, and we were just surrounded by monarch butterflies. Like, I like to tell people this felt like I was in a snow globe of monarch butterflies. And so as it gets like later in the season, you're going to see less of that clustering and more like what the scene is here with those butterflies flying out from Mexico. This is also another photo from Sierra Palone as they're getting ready to migrate. So it's important when you're there to sort of look in and take in all the viewpoints that you can, because you're going to notice something different happening kind of at every level there. So this one, you can kind of see a few butterflies flying in and out. And some years, or right when they first start that migration to move out, you'll see so much that the screen where it's blue, the sky there would be covered just in monarchs. So in Macheros, it's a tradition that you climb up to the rooftop and you watch the sunset. And those are some of my highlights for my trip. And I just wanted to share this quote because it sums up the feeling that I had when I was surrounded by monarchs. So when you stand in a monarch sanctuary, your soul is shaken and your life is changed. So I hope that we have inspired you today to take action, and we have some resources that are available for you. So through the Living Roadway Trust Fund, you can get posters that are about monarchs and milkweed. So here's one side of it. And there's the other side that talks a little bit more about that life cycle. And you can see it as it goes from the egg to the caterpillar all the way through when it starts to emerge from that chrysalis. We also have a poster about butterflies and moths. So some of those that Nick talked about earlier on there. Front and back side for you. And then we also have a variety of booklets that are about pollinators of Iowa, tree booklets, and other native plantings or seed plantings. And then this is just a list of resources. So these are some really great websites that you can go to for more information about anything and everything that you wanted to learn about monarchs. So you can learn about the life cycle, you can learn about plants, how to tag them, how to raise them, all really great sites. And then if you want to know the Airbnb the B&B that I stayed in was Sierra Palone Butterfly, and there's our website there. And if you're interested in tagging with us this year, we're going to partner with Des Moines County Conservation. And on September 6th from 9 to noon, we're going to be at Big Hollow Recreation Area, which is located in Sperry, Iowa. So that's the southeast part of the state. And we are going to be tagging monarchs and running through the prairie to see what we can catch and reporting that information.
Holy moly, what a great presentation. I'd like to thank both Nick and Karen. And hey, folks, let's get into some questions that you may have on this wonderful topic for our presenters here. Okay, here's a question for Karen. Karen, you said you made 2 trips to Mexico. Could you tell us when each one of those were?
Sure, as I moved there. So I went in March of 2020, and then I also went this past season in March of 2024. So a little bit later in the season when they're just starting to come out of those clusters and then start to migrate back up to like our area.
And were they at different locations?
Yes, they are definitely at different locations. So the one slide that shows the map there, where 70% are kind of concentrated in those certain areas. I went to Sierra Chinqua. I also went to El Rosario and then Sierra Palone.
Excellent. Oh, here's a question. This is for Nick. Nick, how long roughly before a pawpaw tree will produce any fruit? Any idea?
It's going to take a while, and depending on your situation and where you've planted your trees, you may have to hand pollinate. Again, those carrion flies aren't necessarily attracted to the flowers. They kind of smell bad. So you do need 2, much like an apple. Yeah, trying to think. Apples you can get fruit. Pawpaw you cannot get fruit. So you need 2 different varieties, 2 different cultivars of a pawpaw in order to produce the fruit. and it's very likely that you have to hand pollinate if you want anything. In commercial pop-up production, they'll actually hang roadkill in between the trees just to try to generate enough of those carrion flies to go out and pollinate and make the fruit. I wouldn't recommend that for your home.
So here's the natural follow-up question. Nick, do you know what's recommended for roadkill to place between the trees for carrion?
That I do not, and I have been forbidden from trying that practice here at our house.
Oh, great. Oh, here's a question in regards to the color. Why did some of the monarch butterflies look like their color had faded? What do we know about color?
Okay, so some of them, their color starts to fade as they make that journey. So right when they first come out, you see all that bright orange, you see all that like very solid black. And the more that they fly, the longer that they're alive, sometimes that color starts to fade. And then by the end of the season, after they're overwintering there, it's a little bit lighter. So you'll just see those differences in colors. I think that they're the brightest to me right after they hatch out of that chrysalis.
And a follow-up there, are there any other butterflies that are in that area along with the monarchs?
Yes, there's lots of different butterflies. I cannot identify all of them, but when we were there, we saw a bunch that were in the sulfur family. So they are the white butterflies or the yellow ones. They also have quite a few moths that they see at night.
Very cool. Okay, here's a question. This is going to be a tall tale. Actually, we might need to crowdsource this one. So Vicky's curious, what are the 18 native Iowa milkweeds?
I will need to pull that up for you.
Well, there's a common, of course, and then there's swamp. Butterfly is one. Common swamp butterfly.
There's a world milkweed.
World, okay.
World, yes. Showy milkweed, poke milkweed, prairie milkweed, tall green, and honeyvine milkweed.
Honeyvine, now I wonder how it got its name. Honeyvine, interesting. Well, I'd like to thank you both, Nick and Karen. Karen, you've inspired me. I've got to see this before the numbers get dwindled so far that it's difficult to make them out. I look at that bar chart that you presented from back in the 90s, and it's just, I can't even imagine what some of that area would look like back when you had hectares and hectares and hectares. So, and in relation to that, Greg is curious, what is the prediction of monarch hectares area for this year and beyond? Do you know, do they keep track of that? Do they do any sort of monitoring, or is when they come to that area when the monitoring happens, and that at that point in time is when they're making the or doing that monitoring?
So they do a lot of monitoring of the monarchs, and a lot of that comes from citizen science. So typically you can enter like when you see a monarch, and then there's also the tagging program where you tag the monarchs, and that includes like the date that you tag them, if they were reared, so you raised them, or if they were found in the wilds. It also includes like the city and state that they were in and the county, and then any other observations that you noticed, and then they record those via the tags, like especially if it's during the migration process. And then once they get down to Mexico, there are individuals that go and look for, you know, basically butterflies that arrive that have those tags on them. They also do a lot of research of just actually going to each site and seeing how many clusters there are, and then they have some magical number estimate that they use, you know, to determine how many are at each site each year. So I am not an expertise on that part of it, but there's a lot of information on different websites that I mentioned on those resources that will, like, it's fascinating to read just how they actually take those population numbers. I just sit there in awe of the monarchs when I'm there, so I don't count.
Well, thank you so much. It's just after 1 here. I think we've wound down and got through all the questions that we had. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here for our second Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinar. Karen, can you give us just a little sneak peek of what folks might be expecting from a Forest Therapy 101 session in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So our forest therapy session that's coming up, we're going to learn a little bit about what forest therapy is, and kind of how it's different from other activities that we would sort of normally do in nature and its health benefits. And then we're going to try doing a little virtual walk as part of the presentation as well.
Okay, great. I can't wait. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Oh, hey, we had one last question sneak in here that I think is worth asking. Bob wants to know, hey, do those tags that you put on the monarchs, do they interfere with the flight at all?
They do not. So the tags that get put on the monarchs, they're a little circle and they have information like letters and numbers on, and then the monarchwatch.org website. And there's just adhesive on the back of the sticker. It's basically like a sticker. So there's adhesive, and then when you press it down gently on the wings, the heat from your hand actually makes that adhesive stick to the butterfly, and it does not affect their flight whatsoever.
Great. Thanks for sharing. Hey, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Everyone, have a great week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks here with Karen and Forest Therapy 101. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.